My name is Davena and I'm here to talk to you today about introversion. But before we begin, I just have to say I'm not technically qualified to talk about introversion. I graduated from university 3 years ago with a BSc Honours in Ecology, so my area of scientific expertise actually lies with plants and insects. However, 7 months after I left university, I landed my first proper job working with insects for one of the largest Crown research institutes in the country. It was an amazing opportunity, and for most of my time there I felt objectively like I was in the place I was meant to be. 8 months later I'd resigned. I was overwhelmed. I was asked by the people there trying to help me, "You did so well at university, you're so qualified for this job. What's wrong?" And I was asking myself the same question. What was wrong with me? So I turned to self-help books. Yep, spoiler alert, I was an introvert. So what did I do? I read books. And it turns out that I was much more introverted than I'd ever realised. It turns out that I'd grown up in a family of introverts, only ever befriended introverts during my school years, flourished at university from the isolated existence it allowed me, and then got some serious culture shock when I entered the real world, i.e. a semi-corporate environment which required daily check-ins, daily check-outs, weekly progress meetings, weekly team meetings, meetings with clients, meetings with anyone you ever needed any information from ever, and sitting in a room full of 50 people twice a day to eat all my meals with, which was different from lectures because you were expected to interact with them. That was on top of learning all the new things that I needed to know for my new job. So I'm not qualified to talk to you today about introversion, but I am an introvert, and I know so much more now about what that means. It's become a matter very dear to my heart, or my head, as we will soon see, and this is what I'd like to share with you all today. So everything I'll talk to you today has come out of these 2 books on introversion, which can be bought online. Introvert Advantage by Marty Olsen-Laney, and Introvert Power by Laurie Helgo, both of whom are psychologists and introverts. There's also Quiet by Susan Cain, which you can find at New Zealand bookstores. I haven't read this yet, but I have listened to Susan Cain's TED Talk on introversion, and it's very good. So, what are introverts and extroverts? We're going to answer for both sides because it's hard to understand one without the context of the other. So, introversion and extroversion are 2 broad types of personality which were theorized by Carl Jung in the early 1900s and popularized through the 16 different type indicators published by Myers-Briggs in the 1950s. The classic understanding defines introverts as those who lose energy in social situations and gain energy from spending time alone, while extroverts gain energy in social settings and lose energy from alone time. What's often lost, though, is that introversion and extroversion describe 2 extremes of a continuum. So while we usually lump people into these 2 black and white groups, in reality anyone can be anywhere on the continuum of slightly introverted or slightly extroverted, all the way to highly introverted or highly extroverted. It just depends on the extent to which you gain or lose energy. So if you gain some energy from alone time, you're probably somewhat introverted, whereas if you gain a lot of energy from alone time, you're probably highly introverted. And if you're somewhere in this golden middle zone, you're what's known as an ambivert. In some ways, ambiverts can seem most contradictory of all because they experience aspects of both introversion and extroversion. Now, this energy scale is a pretty fine shortcut for describing what it means to be an introvert or an extrovert, but this understanding is not an explanation for these types of personality. And that's where I'd like to get across today, that actually, it's all in your head. So humans have 2 primary neurotransmitters which are responsible for feelings of reward in the brain. These are acetylcholine and dopamine. Dopamine is the one that's probably more familiar of the 2. Dopamine is produced in the presence of adrenaline, is generated through movement, and from situations of high novelty. It's the classic feel-good neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine, on the other hand, is like a watered-down version of dopamine. It also generates feelings of reward, but in a low-level way. Acetylcholine generates feelings of calmness and contentment. It helps with long-term memory related to sleep, and is generated while undertaking low-novelty tasks such as thinking and reading. Now, it turns out that introvert brains are sensitive to acetylcholine, while extrovert brains are sensitive to dopamine. What this means is that dopamine is like straight sugar compared to acetylcholine, which is the more subtle sweet of an apple. For an introvert for whom subtle sweet acetylcholine is just right, too much dopamine is overstimulating and doesn't generate feelings of reward. Like people with sensitive teeth getting toothache from having too much sugar, it's easier for an introvert to experience stress and anxiety from activities that generate too much dopamine. On the other hand, extroverts who have a sensitivity to dopamine barely notice the effects of subtle acetylcholine rewards. Dopamine, like sugar, can be addictive, and if you eat too much sugar or salt with your meals, the natural flavour of foods don't do it for you anymore. Now, that's not to say that one is inherently more unhealthy than the other. It's just a way of conceptualizing the stimuli preferences that introverts and extroverts show. So neuroreceptors can explain the different stimulation preferences that each personality type favours. The other part of the equation is the fundamentally different ways that introverts and extroverts then process the stimulation. When blood flows to an organ, any organ, that organ becomes a lot more sensitive, right? The organ is getting ready to do the thing it knows how to do best. The same is true of the brain. Researchers have scanned the brains of both introverts and extroverts to track blood flow in the brain and discovered that in introverts' brains, more blood flowed to parts of the brain that involved internal processes, such as remembering, solving problems, and planning, while in extroverts' brains, more blood flowed to areas in the brain where visual, auditory, touch, and taste are processed. In other words, the extrovert brain was primed to outside sensory information, while the introvert's brain was primed to the internal world of thoughts, ideas, and representations. So in introverts, incoming stimuli takes the following route through the brain. It enters the brainstem where it triggers acetylcholine reward, continues further into the brain where it continues triggering low-level feelings of contentment, which reduces the need for more stimulation. It arrives in the Broca's area, which turns on speech and inner monologue before travelling to the frontal lobe where reasoning and planning happen. Then it's relayed to the hippocampus, where long-term memories start, finally ending in the emotional centre of the brain, the amygdala, which is where feelings and introverts are attached to thoughts. This is a 7-step process, and it's worth pointing out that introverts only reach the emotional centre of the brain by the end of this process. Compare that to extroverts. This is their dominant processing route for incoming stimuli. It enters the brainstem and triggers a dopamine response. It travels further into the brain where it continues triggering dopamine, which alerts the brain to further stimulation. It then travels to the part of the brain called the anterior thalamus, where emotions are attached to actions in extroverts, and ends up in working memory. This is a 5-step process, and extroverts reach their emotional centre by step 4, 3 steps earlier than the introvert. Now, I'd just like to note that I've grossly simplified a few things here for the sake of a presentation, and there is a much more accurate and more comprehensive representation of how this works in the Introvert Advantage. The takeaway version, though, is that an introvert's dominant processing takes a longer pathway and is therefore slower, while an extrovert's dominant processing takes a shorter pathway and is therefore faster. It's crazy to me just how much of introverted behaviour can be explained by understanding these vital pieces of information. The deeper processing of introverts means that they need time to know what they think and feel about things, and quite often have to rediscover things they already knew but were buried in long-term memory. This is in contrast to extroverts, who are able to know much more quickly what they think and how they feel and react accordingly, so are often more responsive and receptive. Introverts tend to be good at remembering exactly what people have said because they encode more deeply into long-term memory. This can freak out extroverts who use talking to discover how they feel. And when it's able to happen, an introvert's deeper processing means that introverts are highly skilled at connecting ideas and building a big picture, whereas extrovert strengths lie in their quick thinking and decision-making abilities. These processing traits mean introverts experience more cyclical thinking and need to reflect on past experiences in order to process things properly, while extroverts tend to be more linear and focus more on output and progress. Finally, the last part of the puzzle is that the human body functions using 2 nervous systems, and that's the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the fight or flight response and is a high energy system, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the rest and digest response and is a low gear or low energy system. Now, high gear, that is the sympathetic nervous system, is fueled by the hormone adrenaline, which, as mentioned, generates dopamine reward. This means the extroverted brain favours the high energy physiological state. On the other hand, The parasympathetic nervous system kicks in from acetylcholine, which generates reward in the introvert brain and is therefore the energy state favoured by introverts. All humans have the capability to throttle up or throttle down their physiological gears, but your brain determines where your physiological homeostasis lies. That is, whether you idle at a higher or a lower rev. And that leads us to the ways in which introverts are geared to slow things down, while extroverts are geared to speed things up. Introverts prefer solo projects away from distracting stimulation, while extroverts thrive in the groupthink environment. Introverts favour writing as a form of expression because it tends to be away from stimuli and they can focus on channeling their inner voice, while extroverts enjoy getting things done because movement generates dopamine. Introverts enjoy doing the same thing for long periods of time because they enjoy depth and have a hard time focusing on an activity if they feel like they will get interrupted, as it tends to require changing gears often, and in turn often worry about approaching others because they don't want to interrupt them. Whereas extroverts hold back and plan whereas extroverts prefer variety and easily move from one activity to another because of their need for novel stimuli. Introverts hold back and plan because they are taking things inside to deal with internally, whereas extroverts engage the sympathetic nervous system to jump straight in because they don't mind dealing with problems interactively. With this understanding, it's easy to see how hard it is for introverts and extroverts to understand each other purely by knowing themselves. This can lead to a variety of misconceptions and miscommunications. For example, when an extrovert is gathering all the outward stimulation that they can, the more reserved introvert can accidentally offend the extrovert because the extrovert might think that the introvert is withholding from them. On the other hand, the introvert can feel like extroverts don't care about them because the extroverts always seem to bypass the introvert's rich inner life. Who else here continually finds that communicating clearly with other people is really, really hard? Well, let's visualize this. If we go back to our energy scale and we choose a point to represent how introverted we are, and if we are now able to recognize that this scale is a representation of how our brains process information, and we realize that the scale is a continuum made up of millions of different shades, and that anyone could be any one of these shades, let's just say that that's a lot of people who experience the world and process information in either subtly different or extremely different shades from you. We all know this to be true, but I still find this mind-blowing. So now we can more fully appreciate that introverts and extroverts are variable strategies within a population. If the brain was designed to solve the problem of processing and acting on information, then being an introvert or an extrovert is a trade-off. Maybe that's why intros and extros have version as their suffix. Introversion brains trade in processing information while extroversion brains trade in actioning information. But that doesn't mean that one is necessarily better than the other, it just depends on the context. And although the presence of both introvert and extrovert strategies in society creates a balance, introverts are usually thought to make up only a small portion of people. Extroversion brains are thought to be the dominant strategy, with the statistic classically given that there are 3 extroverts to every 1 introvert. Turns out these figures are wrong. These figures were based on an outdated study from 1957. They came from an unfinished publication by Myers-Briggs, which surveyed only high school boys, which conferred an age and life stage bias, because high schoolers are often pushed towards extroversion. Yet because of the success of the Myers-Briggs work in general, these figures were taken at face value and have been cited ever since. And it turns out that the proportion of introverts to extroverts in the population is actually a 50-50 split. Introverts make up half of the people that we interact with, which means that this scale actually represents a normal distribution. And that brings me to the introvert problem, also known as the extrovert assumption. The introverted problem is that Western culture is fundamentally orientated towards an assumption of extroversion. The Western culture is a fast-paced lifestyle geared towards speed and progress. This can leave the introvert feeling outpaced, stressed, anxious, and at odds with their fundamental physiology. There is also a bias of discrimination inherent in Western culture. Our definition of success in our jobs and our social lives favours extroversion over introversion. We admire traits such as verbal ability and prefer outward appearances of competence such as confidence, decisiveness, and often the bold, brash risk-taker. Even in areas where introverts thrive, such as academia, where work speaks more than persona, output is still favoured as an indicator of input, and there is a drive for quantity over quality to prove worth and afford value. Compare that to Eastern culture, where you find concepts such as Zen, which emphasises the value of an inward focus through meditation and knowing oneself. Eastern culture is steeped in history and tradition, which aligns with the introvert's bent to process current external experiences in the context of past internal experiences. In Japan, the most fundamental quality that people are taught to have is that, and I'm not going to be able to say this very well, but it's inryo, which means restraining actions and speech towards people in order to afford others respect. The Japanese work ethic favours time and craftsmanship, and Eastern culture recognises that a subdued demeanour often reflects wisdom. Western businessmen who run their mouths are considered rude and idiotic for revealing all their cards. Nevertheless, the extroverted assumption persists, and it means that in Western culture, extroversion is associated with positive language and normalization, whereas introverted ideals are associated with negative language, guilt, shame, and ostracization. In 2010, the American Psychological Association attempted to include a definition of introversion in their diagnostic manual as a deficit in the capacity to feel pleasure or take interest in things, which belies an extroverted assumption that pleasure is something that can be viewed externally and gained from outside the body. In 2012, a study was undertaken which asked introverts to act extroverted and extroverts to act introverted in order to establish whether introverts might be better off as extroverts. The study asked introverts to try acting bold, energetic, talkative, assertive, active, and adventurous, while extroverts were to try acting quiet, lethargic, shy, passive, compliant, and unadventurous. Because the traits the study attributed to introverts were negations of positive extrovert traits, not surprisingly, the study concluded that being an introvert is a downer for everyone who has to be an introvert. The introvert problem is that language defines our cognitive biases. If that same study were flipped and positive introvert traits were negated to describe extroverts, extroverts would present pretty poorly, unreceptive, gushing, superficial, unreflective, and loud. Ouch. Ultimately, the introvert problem is that the Western normalization of extroversion comes at the expense of the introvert. Introverts in Western society feel pressure to conform to the extroverted assumptions that these societies place on them. The introverts who other people could have sworn are extroverts are what Laurie Helgo from Introvert Power dubs the socially accessible introvert. The socially accessible introvert has learned to ignore their physiology to the extent that they are able to present the facade of extroversion and may even believe themselves to be one. These people may be another reason why we see so many more extroverts in the world than what there actually are. The socially accessible introvert exists because introverts in Western culture are faced with a choice: alienate themselves from themselves by trying to conform to extroverted ideals, or alienate themselves from society and experience guilt and shame from others. Regardless of the choice introverts make, ultimately it's a lose-lose either way. Alienation means feeling like you are someplace you don't belong, and that manifests for the introvert as feeling like they cannot relate to people, or that they don't belong in their own body. Studies have shown that out of the two personality types, introverts are at a greater risk of depression and suicide in cultures that value an extroverted view of happiness. Now, I have a confession to make. I'm nearing the 20-minute mark for this presentation and may even have gone over at this stage. I've known for a long time how much stuff I've been wanting to cram into this talk, but I thought I might be able to narrow it down enough. When I started getting worried that I couldn't, I approached Will, that's Will over there, he's responsible for these talks, about the possibility of extending it, and I received an absolute no. Presentations are meant to be brief overviews of ideas, he said. It's made that way on purpose so that people can get a variety of ideas each month. You're not allowed to go over, it's not how we do things. I was heartbroken. I love these ideas, and at the thought of not being able to get them out, I experienced quite a familiar physiological response. My heart rate increased. I started to feel agitated, even a bit anxious, and outwardly started pacing back and forth in order to try and think it through. This was the fight or flight response in me. I tried again with Will. Why is it not done? I asked him. And he said, it's about respect. It's about respecting that people have come here today to listen to a 20-minute presentation, not a half-hour one. And I thought, that's odd. I always thought presentations were about the ideas. In true introvert style, it only occurred to me a while later. Isn't wanting a variety of topics over depth and detail not an extroverted assumption? Isn't taking ages to do anything without interruption the introvert's way? Have I not just spent the last 3 days preparing a presentation on the extroverted bias in Western culture, and is the whole point of this presentation not to try and challenge that bias? And that got me thinking about presentations in general. I've spent all my school years being educated in what successful presentations are. Lots of eye contact, for example. Short and snappy. So it is today that because of the nature of this presentation, I decided that I would rather get across everything that I wanted to say at the expense of proper eye contact and at the expense of a 20-minute time limit. I decided I would rather explore this topic from many angles and to take my time in doing so, because to do so for an introvert is enriching and not as unnecessary as many extroverts may feel. For those of you that this choice offends, I am sorry. Introverts know what it's like to have to go against their grain. So I am sorry. However, I will use a small slice of extra time that I'm wrangling for myself out of this fast-paced existence to say, welcome to the introvert's world. Welcome. Because these ideas are important, damn it, and it is an extroverted assumption to think that they are not. With that said, I have 6 more slides left, so I will carry on if that's okay. So I wanted to make the disclaimer that a lot of these are American examples, and I don't think we're quite as bad here in New Zealand. If we go back to our continuum, American and Japanese culture probably represent the 2 extremes, whereas I imagine New Zealand would be closer to the centre on average. However, the trend remains. Here in New Zealand, we understand the risk of getting sunburned more than any other country because of our high risk of skin cancer. We have ad campaigns encouraging people to do what is best for their health. Use sunscreen, wear protective clothing, or most effective of all, avoid being outside when the risk of burning is greatest. Also here in New Zealand, there is the tendency to see extroverts as social, which is true, but to label introverts as the negation, antisocial. The thing is, when people get sunburned after being in the sun, we don't call them anti-sun. Introverts need vitamin D just as much as extroverts, but forcing introverts to conform to extroverted social assumptions in order to get this vitamin D is the equivalent of forcing pale-skinned people to spend hours in the sun with no skin protection. Some people, like the socially accessible introvert, might be able to develop a tan, but that doesn't stop tans from being kind of unhealthy in a lot of ways. And there will always be those who simply don't tan. Maybe it's time to teach introverts mental health protection. Let us start as a society with our social attitudes to prevent the social alienation that introverts experience because of their physiology. Introversion and extroversion should not be seen as diametrically opposed opposites. Instead, they represent a scale of functional strategies that afford all versions a unique combination of strengths and talents. Because a balanced view is an empathetic view, and I believe it's time for our attitudes in our society to be the same way. And if anyone would like to learn ways that this can be the case, then read these books that I mentioned at the beginning, and I'm sure that there are probably many more out there now that we know to look for them. Thank you.